1764, wrote the rights of the British colonies, asserted and proved, where he covered the 4 different theories of government and pointed out that if all men are created equal, then they should be treated equal. The laws of nature have given to all men a natural right to be free, and they have it in their power to make themselves so if they please. A government which lays its foundation in force and mere brutal power, it is objected. For that system destroys all distinction between right and wrong. Tyranny in all kinds is despised, whether it be in the hands of one, the few, or the many. Government, being for the good of mankind, is above all to provide for the security, the quiet, and happy enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. 2 men born under the same law of nature in distant lands would simply be 2 men if they would by chance meet on a desolate island, white or black. The colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black. There can be no idea of government in which a person, an overseer, or the devil exercises power over 10,000 of his fellow men, born with the same right to freedom and sweet enjoyments of liberty and life as their unrelenting taskmasters, overseers, and planters. This empire and these British American colonies must be built on the principle of justice, moderation, and equity, the only principles that can make a state flourish, enable it to elude its enemies. Let us be parties then to the ideal of liberty for all, without distinctions of wealth, title by birth, nor colors of flesh and textures of hair, but by the principle that all men are equal in rights and liberties. This time marks a very important time, for in 1773, Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia, he has written, "A spirit of humanity and religion begins to awaken in several colonies in favor of the poor Negro." On April 14th, 1775, co-founded with Quakers, the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes unlawfully held in bondage has now become our first American abolitionist anti-slavery society. Thomas Paine. You all know Thomas Paine. He also helped that very same society. And he wrote that some desperate wretches should be willing to steal and enslave men by violence and murder for gain is rather lamentable than strange. But that many civilized, nay, Christian people should approve and be concerned is the savage practice is surprising. You know that in 1775, just last year, our Continental Congress has declared that no slave shall be imported into any of the 13 United Colonies.
Hear, hear.
Now we know that this is just because of a boycott of British goods, but what will it lead to next? In these colonies, with 2.5 million, 1/5, 5 million, are enslaved Africans. Did you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote a passage in a part of the American Declaration of Independence that was in his first draft, but removed? Here it is. He, King George III, has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, and in the persons of distant people, captured and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or incur miserable death in their transportation here. This piratical warfare is determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, and has suppressed every legislative attempt to suppress it. He is now exciting those very people to rise up arms against us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them. We're going to switch back and forth and discuss about the roles and contributions of African Americans in this war for independence. During militias, you wanted to talk now for a while?
Right. Thank you guys for coming. I'm briefly going to come in here for just a moment and highlight what I think is a very interesting little facet of the American Revolution. And that is the fact that there were African American soldiers that fought both for the British as well as for the Americans. We'll start with the British side, as I think that one's a very interesting one because we get a lot of love, at least in terms of the historical context of the American Revolution. I'm sure if you were here earlier, you would have heard glorious Lord Dunmore speak. And of course, he has a very famous proclamation that would be made in 1775, Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which essentially laid out that if you were a runaway from a plantation in Virginia, Maryland, or the surrounding colonies, if you entered British lines and you joined Lord Dunmore, then you would essentially gain your freedom by fighting for the British. After releasing this proclamation, he would receive a number of men that had escaped from various plantations, and he would have enough to create what's known as the Ethiopian Regiment. Now, this would also be in the later part of 1775. Now, this regiment itself would be outfitted similarly to British soldiers, but they would also receive some surplus uniforms and equipment as well, some of them wearing coats that would be similar to that of the British Army. That being said, though, the Ethiopian Regiment would also wear this very interesting sort of linen kind of shirt or tunic, and they would write the phrase "liberty to slaves" upon the actual outfit itself. And from my understanding historically, we don't know, so historians are still looking into see this, but they believe that the phrase "liberty to slaves" was meant to sort of counteract the patriot phrase, right? "Give me liberty or give me death," stated by Patrick Henry, so sort of counterbalance to this. Now, the men that fought in the Ethiopian Regiment would have some of their first actions in Virginia, and they would do somewhat well against the Patriots. However, they would consistently see more casualties than their overall British white counterparts. Later on in the year, they would also suffer through bouts of various disease and sickness, and it would come to be that they would end up having to leave the Virginia area to go and be inoculated with a number of these diseases. In the time that they were recovering, they would also involve themselves in some other skirmishes against the Patriots. But finally, in the end, they would end up in New York. And when they would land in New York, they would bolster the British forces that would be there as they were defending against the Americans. They would fight in the Battle of Long Island as well, and some of them would also join a pioneer battalion, like a combat engineering battalion as group, and they would serve rather well. By the end, when the British would leave New York, around 1780, they would join the British fleet, and their families, as well as themselves, they would leave America and then go to Canada, at which point they would set themselves up with some land that was located in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately for those men that had served in the Ethiopian regiment, they did not necessarily receive the best land in Nova Scotia, and so they dealt with very harsh winters. So many of them died due to starvation from the cold as well. This, of course, angered many of them, because not only were they dealing with the difficulties from the British government and the fact of owning their own land, it would eventually be decided that perhaps they should go to Africa. And so many of them would, and they would form a colony in Sierra Leone, where it was said they might be able to have some form of self-determination for themselves. This is not entirely true. They would still be overseen by the British government, and there were tensions between them and the government themselves, but they would stay there peacefully. Now, something else to mention as well about the Ethiopian regiment is a famous individual who goes by the name of Colonel Tai, real name being Titus. This man would be born sometime in the 1750s to a... Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my.
Yeah, we've been trying to fix it.
Okay, no problem. All right, minor technical
Don't mind
difficulty.
me, the governor done worries.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir.
I do what I can
Thank you, sir.
to support them.
Thank you, sir. Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!
I like it. Nothing?
Huzzah! Yeah, huzzah!
You're no governor.
No, good. Now, yes, where was I? Colonel Tai. So, he would be born close to the New Jersey area, and he would flee to the man that would own him, a gentleman by the name of Cornelius, who was also a Quaker. And it was at this time that the Quakers were also dealing with their own form of ending slavery amongst themselves. But this gentleman himself did not want to give up his slavery. So, Tai would run away. In the Philadelphia Gazette, there would be a report put out about him, and it would describe the runaway Titus. What I find very interesting about this is that one of the quotes that it says in there is that he's a man of average height who does not look very black, which I think is a very interesting statement to make when we're considering someone who's enslaved. And the reason for that is because Colonel Tai was of mixed race. And if you were a mixed race man or woman, if you were born to someone who was a slave, you would also still be a slave, right? So those things apply to him. Now, we don't know if Colonel Tai ever joined the Ethiopian regiment, but the legend says that he does. And it says that he would join Dunmore and the Ethiopian regiment to do some fighting there, and then eventually leave that regiment and then go back to New Jersey to fight the Patriots. Now, we see him pop up again in the historical record around 1780, and it's at this point that he's leading what's known as the Black Brigade, which is a mixed group of black and white loyalist guerrillas who are going around burning, fighting, and doing essentially a very small war in the New Jersey area against the Patriot forces that are there, which at that point was very much under the control of the Patriots themselves. Now, the interesting thing about the title Colonel is that he's not actually a colonel. This was more of an honorific title because he had managed to gather these men up and lead them together, and so he's sort of leading the brigade itself. He was very good at the guerrilla warfare that he conducted, and he did a lot of raiding as well via small boats as he crossed the Queensbury River. Now, the final moments of Colonel Tai, I think, are very, very interesting because he had been leading an attack against a well-known Patriot commander whose last name, I believe, was Huddy. Now, he had managed to corner Mr. Huddy on a small local farm in an inn, and this was supposed to be sort of the last stand of Huddy. Now, in the process of besieging the farm, the Black Brigade thought that they were being attacked, or rather that they were attacking a much larger force because of the amount of fire that was coming outside of the actual inn/farm. It turns out there was a young woman who had joined Huddy who had been loading and firing muskets from different elements in different parts of the windows. In an attempt to defeat him, the Black Brigade decided to light fire to the actual farm itself and the inn, and this is what flushed him out. He comes out, decides that he no longer wants to fight, and says, "But could you at least please put out the fire?" They do that. They then take him into custody, put him on a small boat, and they begin to go down the river. Because of the actions that go on at the farm, the local patriot militia is now alerted to Colonel Ty and the Black Brigade. And it's in that moment that they ambush him as he's taking away Mr. Huddy down the river. In the process of fighting Huddy, Huddy himself jumps into the river and is also wounded by the Patriots, probably an errant musket ball. But it's in that moment that we think that Ty himself also receives a very grievous wound. He takes a musket ball, possibly in the wrist, and he would then die 3 days later of tetanus, and then a new commander would come up and take his place and would continue the fight pretty much until the end of the war. What we do know is that at the end of the war, those men would be given some form of parlay, and they would also be allowed to go up to Canada. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Patriot side of the situation. There were African Americans who fought for the Americans even as early as 1775 and in the Massachusetts area, and this is because there were a number of individuals who were free and also enslaved who would be part of the local Massachusetts militia, the New England militia. And this goes back even to an earlier time as well. We have to remember that at that time and in those areas, local defense against Native Americans is very important, and you're not going to leave a man in his house to not defend the territory. You want as many bodies as you can to defend those homes. So they would in fact arm those individuals. And it would be in those early times of the Revolution that you would see a number of African Americans in those local Massachusetts militias. Now, by the time George Washington meets up with those militias, he would actually be very surprised to see not only African Americans, but also Native Americans in those militias as well. And Washington himself, as we know, also owned slaves. He was not accustomed to seeing those individuals with weapons because obviously in Virginia there were laws that prevented African Americans from joining the militias and bearing arms. And this is because of the fact that those individuals were very frightened of slave insurrections. Right? So one of the things that many of the enslavers always feared was that slaves could rise up, kill them at any point in time, and take over the plantation and what have you. Long story short, though, after Dunmore's declaration, Washington would turn his opinion about having black troops around. And he would write to Congress essentially saying that this is something that we should most likely invest in. And yes, it would end up happening. And so they would allow for that type of recruitment. Now, the first Rhode Island is very interesting because there were already African Americans who'd been serving in a Rhode Island regiment. And pretty much after 1775, the regiment would come together and sort of formulate itself into a more functional group after some of the reforms and changes that happened after Washington would join. And so within that regiment, you would have white soldiers, Native American soldiers, as well as black soldiers as well. And you would also include individuals who would be enslaved, and some would also be indentured. And amongst the Rhode Island regiment, there was also a specific company that was segregated, and it made up of basically all black soldiers. The Rhode Island Regiment would also fight pretty much the entire war. They would be at a number of major battles, one that would take place in New York, and they would also be at Yorktown as well, and they would serve with distinction. One of their key moments being the Battle of Trenton, where they would end up acting as a rear guard for the Patriot forces as they're being speared from the field. The men in the 1st Rhode Island would try and blunt the advance of the British, and many of their comrades would speak very highly of their courageous nature as they defended against the British to sort of give Washington and those men time to retreat off of the battlefield. Now you might be wondering what happened to those men that were enslaved in the Continental Army, or at least the Patriot forces. A number of them would be freed at the end of the war per their contracts. Unfortunately, some also were not free. The individuals that did own them, for whatever reason, felt that they did not want to give them freedom, even though they had served very admirably and honorably in those services. It's sad to say that happened, but that is the nature of the time. The takeaway, though, that I want you to get from these little historic stories and all of these elements that I've shared with you is that the struggle for black freedom, specifically in American history, is not something that pops up out of nowhere. It's something that exists within the nation from the time that we start to see African slavery hit the North American continent. And even though we see black soldiers here during the American Revolution, you would see them later on as well. Right? You would see them during the War of 1812. You would see some elements of that during the U.S.-Mexico War, and you absolutely see them during the American Civil War. Right? All of those times, the idea of joining the army, fighting for the country, and receiving your freedom was the ultimate goal. And the reason for that, ultimately, is because those individuals did not want to be slaves. They wanted to be whole human beings, and so they were given an opportunity, and they took it, right? And it happened to be under military arms. Now, that being said, joining the army, fighting for those countries was not the only way that people became free. There were obviously very strong abolitionist movements that were being started during this time of the American Revolution and would continue, even more so now. All right, I've thrown a lot at you. I'm going to pass it back to you. I have been your most humble and honorable servant.
Many famous men in this time period, fighting for the cause and leading the cause, endorsed enlisting African Americans in the military service. These are men like John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, Henry and his son John Lawrence. They looked at South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, that 14th colony, and said the number of Africans enslaved there far outnumber the white people there. If we let them into the army, they will have more to fight for. Liberty will mean more than the white group. Liberty. What does it mean? Different things to different people. Even General Lincoln and General Greene, two other famous names, felt that South Carolina and Georgia, even though the majority of the population, because the majority of the population was of African descent, should raise multiple battalions of African units. So the natural strength of this part of the country in point of numbers appears to consist much more in the blacks than in the whites. He specifically requested 4 infantry regiments, a corps of engineers, along with multiple battalions. Greene told Washington, the far greater part of the people, however, are opposed to it. Ultimately, South Carolina did not approve the raising of my battalion. Lawrence said, the plan which brought me to this country was urged with zeal, which the subject inspired, but the single voice of reason was drowned out by the howlings of a triple-headed monster in which prejudice, greed, and cowardice were united. Instead, South Carolina did not enlist any black battalions. Georgia also did not enlist any black battalions. If you were a white man who enlisted into a Georgia military unit, you received, in your gratitude, 1 slave. They were used as currency instead. If you had experience and you were re-enlisted, you got 3. Liberty. What does that mean? Of this, the most important thing is, this is the beginning of the abolition movement. This is the beginning. Liberty and the fight that all men are created equal. Thank you for listening.